So we continue with our neuroanatomy session, and we have told you how to draw a coronal section and a sagittal section through the brain. Now we'll tell you how to look at its lateral side, lateral view, and inferior view, so that you at least come to know what part lies where. First, the lateral view. So the lateral view is this is the cerebral hemisphere. This is the lateral fissure which divides it into a frontal lobe. There is a fissure like this. It divides it into the frontal lobe, a parietal lobe. So this is the parietal lobe and this is the occipital lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. So frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. And there are two fissures here also. But this is the lateral fissure, and this is very important because it bears the lateral cerebral artery, which usually gets thrombosed and is responsible for stroke. Under it you find the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, which goes into the spinal cord. In the midbrain you have the corpora quadrigemina, the superior and the inferior colliculus, the cerebellar, superior cerebellar peduncle, and here you have the cerebellum, and this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle of the medulla, and this is the spinal cord. Now this region is like this. This is the superior and the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the middle cerebellar peduncle is coming from the pons. Superior cerebellar peduncle from the midbrain, inferior cerebellar peduncle from the medulla, and the middle cerebral peduncle coming from the pons. And between these you have the space which is the fourth ventricle, which is of course inside this matter, and between the pons and medulla you have the facial colliculus, in which the seventh nerve circles round the sixth nerve nucleus and emerges here. So this is how you draw the lateral view. Now we'll draw for you the inferior view. So if you want to draw the inferior view, you first have to draw the two cerebral peduncles which are from midbrain. Underneath you have to keep the pons like this, which is going into the middle cerebellar peduncle. This is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And underneath you have the medulla oblongata, the median line, the fasciculus cuneatus, the fasciculus gracilis, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So this makes the medulla oblongata. Above this you have to make the optic chiasma. So this is the optic nerve. This is the optic chiasma where it's crossing, and these are the optic tracts which are going behind the midbrain into the superior colliculus. This is the region of the hypothalamus, and here you have the pituitary gland, and this is the hypothalamus, and here you have the peduncle of pituitary gland, and you have the pituitary gland. Now once you have drawn this, you draw the midline, you draw the frontal lobes, and then you draw the cerebellum, and here you have the temporal lobes. So frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe is above the cerebellum. Here is the midbrain. Here is the pons going to the middle cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum, and here is the medulla, which has the pyramidal tracts in front. The main, the anterior and the lateral pyramidal tracts, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. I am sorry I told you this was fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis, that is posterior. So here you have the anterior pyramidal tract, corticospinal tract, cortex to spine, and you have the lateral corticospinal tract. Alright. So these are the main motor tracts which are responsible for voluntary movement. So learn to practice to draw these, and we'll practice drawing the coronal section once. Corpus callosum, septum lucidium, fornix, thalamus. In between is the third ventricle, then the caudate nuclei, between the, here is your lentiform nucleus, and here is the lateral fissure, the insula, the temporal lobe, and here you will have the midbrain. Here you will have the pons giving the middle cerebellar peduncle to this, and finally here you will have the medulla oblongata, and in this medulla oblongata you will have the inferior cerebellar peduncle lateralmost. This cerebellar peduncle is the superior cerebellar peduncle going to the midbrain. So this is the fourth ventricle that you are seeing, and from this fourth ventricle you will see a midline, a fasciculus cuneatus, a fasciculus gracilis, and this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and here will be the split area of the cerebellum. Alright, and we have told you how to make this is the corticospinal tract. Start from here. This is corona radiata, this is internal capsule, then they pass through the midbrain, through the pons, and then go into the pyramidal tracts on the anterior side of the medulla. We'll help you make once again the sagittal section, and this is the corpus callosum. Here is the fornix, here is the septum lucidium, here you have the pituitary body and the fundibulum, here will be the lateral and medial geniculate body of the cerebellum, the pineal body corresponding to the pituitary body, the superior and the inferior colliculus of the midbrain, the pons, the medulla and spinal cord, and this is the superior cerebellar peduncle. From the medulla is coming the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and here you have the floor of the fourth ventricle. The distinction between the medulla and the pons is by a projection here, which is the facial colliculus, in which The seventh nerve is circling round the sixth nerve. So this is the sixth nerve, and the seventh nerve is circling around it. This is the seventh, and this is forming. This seventh nerve is called as facial nerve. So this is forming the facial follicles. Then you have like this the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe going to the temporal lobe, occipital lobe going to the temporal lobe, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and here you will have the cerebellum, and this will be lying in the fossa, pituitary fossa, formed by the body of the sphenoid bone, and this is the sphenoidal layer sinus here, and this is the area of the nose. So we have told you how to make all the sections of the brain, and please learn to recognize them. Thank you.